So let's graph y equals x squared minus 3x plus 4. And I already have it typed in for us. And when we type in y equals x squared minus 3x plus 4 in our calculator, we get this picture. But more specifically, let's get a picture drawn on our paper. So we can go to second and graph, which gets us up to the table function. And here are some points that we can possibly use on our graph. -1, 8, 0, 4, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 4, 4, 8. And what we can't see in this particular quadratic is we can't see the vertex, but I bet we can figure out where it goes. If we look back at the picture, again, here's the picture, so we know roughly where that goes. And depending on the orientation of the board, it's roughly here. And now that we have this drawn, the question is, do you think that we can factor this quadratic and if you're not sure, look at this. Factors of 4 are 1 and 4 and 2 and 2. Will either of those combine to be 3? And if we did 1 minus 4, we would get -3. But what happens if you multiply 1 times -4? 1 times -4 is -4, not +4. We cannot factor this problem. And as we take a look at the picture, it kind of makes sense, because what we're doing when we're solving by graphing is we're figuring out where does the graph cross the x-axis. And what happens in this picture is that the graph doesn't cross the x-axis. So let's write that down. The graph, the obvious, does not cross or touch the x-axis. So there are no real roots to this equation, and we can't factor. Graph does not cross the x-axis, so there are no real roots, and we cannot factor the function. So a couple things about quadratic formula, and actually this entire unit is all about solving quadratics, and we've learned about 2 of the methods so far. And one of the methods that we've learned about was graphing. We just did that on this last problem, or the first problem here in the notes. We solved by graphing. We also have solved by factoring. Those are 2 methods that we use to solve, and they work best when we can look at the picture and find the roots, or when we can factor the quadratic. But as we've seen here, when we cannot factor, or when graphing doesn't give us an exact answer, what we can use is we can use the quadratic formula to find the solutions. And solutions are also known as roots or zeros. or x-intercepts, where the graph crosses the x-axis. Quadratic formula you're probably mostly familiar with is the opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac divided by 2a. And let's take that formula and let's use it on our problem that we had up top there. And what I can recommend for you is that when you set this up here, that you label the fact that a is 1. It's the number in front of the x squared term. B is -3. It's the number in front of the x. And C is the constant. It's 4. Be careful with signs. That's the only place that I can really anticipate that you're going to have trouble when we fill this in. Because we're solving for x. So x equals -b. And again, some of you are going to go and directly change that to positive, and that simply is because you've had a lot of experience in geometry working with the quadratic formula. The opposite of b, plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, all divided by 2 times a. So we just took our values that we were given and we're filling them into the quadratic formula. If you're using your calculator, the -3, I highly recommend that you write in parentheses. Because when we square that, and actually let me go backwards here for a second, minus a negative is going to give us a positive. So it's going to be 3. Plus or minus, -3 squared is 9. And that's where the parentheses come into play. If you don't put -3 squared, the -3 in parentheses, and then squared in your calculator, it's not going to give you the correct answer. Squared means times itself. -3 times -3. 9 minus 4 times 1 times 4. 16. Divided by 2. Well, we're close to finishing here, and maybe you already are finished, but 9 minus 16 is -7. And we do need to do one more thing to have this expression completely simplified. And that is, we need to remember what the square root of -1 equals. And the more you say it out loud, the more you're going to remember it. It does equal, I heard somebody say it, square root of -1 is I, radical 7/2. By the way, this means 3 plus I times the square root of 7 all divided by 2. And it means 3 minus I radical 7 divided by 2. There are 2 answers. What we saw earlier is that we cannot factor this expression. Couple things for quadratic formula. And again, a lot of you have had the experience with the quadratic formula, so you don't need a lot of extra explanation. But the quadratic formula has to be set equal to 0. And in general, that's a good habit to get into when we solve quadratics, which is our entire unit. Also, the quadratic formula has to be in what's called standard form. And all that standard form means is it means that the quadratic is in what's called descending order. Descending order means it's the highest exponent first, then the next highest, then the next highest, and then the next highest, and the last value in the quadratic will be the constant. When we look at example number 1, it's not quite in standard form because it's not in, doesn't equal 0. So we can start with that. We can add 3 to both sides. and we get 3x squared plus 7x plus 3 equals 0. Now the equation's in standard form, and it is in descending order. X squared, the 2 is the highest exponent. Then it's got 7x, x to the first, that's the next highest exponent. Then the last term, 3, is the constant. It's in the right order for us to say A is 3, B is 7, and C is 3. And you can see the quadratic formula there at the top of your paper to fill this in. So it's going to be the opposite of B, plus or minus the square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all divided by 2 times A. When we use the quadratic formula, this is giving us the roots of the equation. Where does this equation cross the x-axis? You can type it in your calculator. 7 squared is 49. 4 times 3 is 12, times 3 is 36. Divided by 6. And now we can simplify that. 49 minus 36 is 13. Divided by 6. And in fact, that is our exact answer that we're going to fill in our blank up above. Negative 7 plus or minus the square root of 13 divided by 6. But we can also come up then with the rounded solutions. And first of all, if you have a fraction button on your calculator, I recommend that you use it. I will do it without, but I recommend that you use it. And I'm going to start with using it. So if we use our fraction button, alpha y equals, number 1, what we're going to type in, negative 7 plus the square root of 13, and then divide by 6. So notice I could only do 1, because it said plus or minus. But there is it with the, thank you. There it is with the fraction. If you don't have that fraction button, then you have to do parentheses, negative 7 plus the square root of 13, arrow, close the parentheses, divide by 6. It will still give you the same answer. 1 with the fraction button, 1 without. Negative 0.565, if we're rounding to the nearest hundredth, remember that's going to give us negative 0.57. If you have the fraction button, then that means that more than likely you can take this, and I need to get rid of that arrow there, but you can take your screen and you can arrow back up to this fraction. It's highlighted on there. Press enter. And then when we go back here, I'm using my left hand arrow button. When we get to the plus, the only difference is it was negative 7 plus or minus. I'm going to type in minus. The minus to the right on your screen, not underneath, not to the bottom, to the right of your screen. And that's going to give us our other value. When we're rounding, negative 1.767 to the nearest hundredth, that's 2 decimal spaces. So 7 means that we're going to get negative 1.77. Without the fraction button on your calculator, it's parentheses, negative 7 minus the square root of 13, arrow out of that, close the parentheses, divided by 6, will still give you the same value. Less typing with the fraction button if you have it. Can we factor this quadratic? We've gotten big long decimals on there. We cannot factor that. So let's see what happens when we do example number 2. And again, many of you have the experience with the quadratic formula. You can just work ahead of me and go back and check your answers here momentarily. The nice part on problem number 2 is that it is in standard form already. And we can start by identifying the fact that A is 2, B is 11, and C is -6. It's in descending order. X squared is the first term. X is the second term. The constant is the last term. And when we fill in our quadratic formula, X equals -11 plus or minus the square root of 11 squared minus 4 times A times C, all divided by 2 times A. Once again, I recommend that you use parentheses on the B squared part. It's not so critical here, but we get -11 plus or minus when we type it in, 121 minus 4 times 2 is 8 times -6 is -48, all divided by 4. If we simplify that a little bit more, we have -11 plus or minus, well, minus a negative gives us plus a positive, and 121 plus 48 is 169 divided by 4. And the question is, can we simplify the square root of 169? And the first thing for us to try is if we go back to our calculator and we type in the square root of 169, we don't get a big long decimal. We get the number 13, which is nice for us. Let's put this off to the side. Because now, when we look at this problem here, we have really x equals -11 plus 13 divided by 4, plus or minus -11 plus or minus 13 over 4, which means that we can simplify this more. This ultimately means that -11 plus 13 divided by 4, if you have a fraction button and you want to type it in that way, and -11 minus 13 over 4. The fraction button, alpha y equals -11 plus 13 divided by 4 gives us 1/2. If we do without the fraction button, -11 minus 13, close the parentheses, divided by 4, we get -6. So when we go back and fill in our values here, this was the 1/2, this was the -6, our exact value is 1/2 and -6. And in fact, in terms of rounded solutions, I would have written 1/2 and -6, but since it says round to the nearest hundredth, how do we write 1/2 as a decimal? 0.5. And -6. Can we factor this function? Yes. So to finish, once again, the nice thing on problem number 3, and there is one little piece here that I think that you should watch very quickly. A is 2, B is -2, C is 5. When we fill in the quadratic formula, the opposite of B, plus or minus square root of B squared minus 4 times A times C, all divided by 2 times A. Well, what happens here is we get 2. Double negative gives us a positive, plus or minus the square root of 4 minus 40 divided by 4. Right now I'm going fast here. Pause the video later if you need to. We get 2 plus or minus the square root of negative 36 over 4. But when we simplify this, the square root of negative 36, we need to simplify the square root of negative 1, and we need to simplify the square root of 36. What's the square root of negative 1? Ah, what's the square root of 36? 6. This becomes 2 plus or minus 6i divided by 4, which is a good answer, but it's not completely simplified. And the thing is, 2 is even, and 6 is even, and 4 is even. We can simplify this by dividing 2 by 2, and we get 1. Divide 6 by 2, we get 3. Don't forget the I. Divide 4 by 2, and we get 2. And now we've simplified this problem so that we have 1 plus or minus 3i divided by 2. We can't do anything to round. And because the answer has an I in it, we cannot factor either.